The sun over the New Mexico Territory in the summer of 1878 was not a giver of life, but a tyrant. It bleached the sky to a pale, unforgiving blue and baked the land until it cracked like old pottery. The dust, a fine red powder, was a constant plague. It coated every surface, gritted between the teeth, and turned the air into a shimmering haze that distorted the horizon. Hope was a scarce commodity, scarcer even than water. The Rio Grande, usually a proud, muddy artery, had dwindled to a sluggish, shallow stream, its banks wide and exposed like weeping wounds. For Ethan Cole, this land was both his kingdom and his cage. At 35, he owned a sprawling ranch that stretched as far as the eye could see, a legacy built by his father's sweat and his own. But the land, for all its vastness, felt empty. The silence in his large, sturdy ranch house was a living thing, a constant reminder of his wife. Sarah, gone 2 years now, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley like a phantom. He was a wealthy man on paper, a king ruling over dust and debt. Each morning, he rose before the sun, the habit of a lifetime warring with the weariness in his soul. He'd stand on his porch, a mug of black coffee in hand, and watch the world turn from gray to gold, a spectacle that once filled him with peace, but now only highlighted the starkness of his solitude. His cattle were thin, their ribs showing through their hides as they wandered listlessly in search of sustenance. The grass was scorched yellow, and the creeks that fed his pastures had dried to dusty scars on the earth. The pressure was more than just the weather. It had a name and a face. 2 faces. In fact, the first belonged to Banker Rowe, a man whose heart was as dry and barren as the land itself. Rowe was a creature of ledgers and contracts, his eyes small and sharp, always calculating. He held the note on Ethan's ranch, a note that was coming due with the unforgiving certainty of a sunrise. The second face was that of Deacon Harlow. Harlow was a pillar of the small community of Redemption Flats, a man who spoke of God's will with a fervent piety that barely concealed the greed coiling in his gut. He saw Ethan's land not as a home or a legacy, but as an opportunity. He and Rowe were circling, a pair of vultures waiting for the final, inevitable collapse. That morning, the tension was a physical weight on Ethan's shoulders. He saddled his horse, a stoic buckskin named Cinder, and rode out to check the northern fence line, the one that bordered the river. The air was already hot, the kind of heat that promised a brutal afternoon. He rode with a familiar tightness in his jaw, his gaze sweeping over his domain. He saw not the beauty of the mesas against the sky, but the encroaching threat of failure. He was losing to the drought, losing to the bank, losing to the ghost of a life he could no longer have. As he neared the river, a sound broke the morning stillness. A splash, not the lazy flop of a fish, but something more deliberate, more desperate. He reined Cinder in, his hand instinctively going to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He was a man who had learned to expect trouble. He dismounted, tying Cinder to a gnarled mesquite tree, and moved toward the riverbank with the quiet tread of a hunter. The water, what was left of it, flowed listlessly around a cluster of large, sun-bleached boulders. He crept closer, peering through a screen of brittle willows, and then he saw her. She was in the water, submerged up to her shoulders, her back pressed against the hard curve of a rock. Her clothes lay in a small, ragged pile on the bank. Her skin was pale in the murky water, and her wet hair, the color of dark honey, was plastered to her head and neck. She was shivering, despite the oppressive heat of the day, a tremor that ran through her slight frame like a fever. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the opposite bank, filled with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the very air from his lungs. She was a hunted animal, gone to ground in the last place she could think to hide. Ethan had heard the whispers in town. They followed him from the general store to the saloon. Talk of a girl, a drifter from Texas, who carried a curse. Mary Louise Carter, they called her, though most just spat the name Lou. They said she was an omen of ill fortune. A town in the Panhandle had suffered a flash flood the day she arrived. Another community had seen its crops wither under a plague of locusts after she passed through. Now, she'd been seen near Redemption Flats, and the drought had tightened its grip like a hangman's noose. Deacon Harlow had even mentioned her in his Sunday sermon, a veiled reference to a Jezebel bringing ruin upon the righteous. Ethan had dismissed it as ignorant superstition, the fearful ramblings of people looking for someone to blame for their misfortunes. But seeing her now, so utterly vulnerable, stripped of everything, he felt a strange and unwelcome stirring in his chest. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a jolt of recognition. He knew that kind of desperation. He lived with his own version of it every day. She hadn't seen him. She was too consumed by whatever she was hiding from. He watched for a long moment, his mind racing. To leave her would be cruel. To approach her might scare her into bolting. He was a large man, and his presence alone was often intimidating. He took a breath, letting it out slowly, and stepped out from behind the willows. The snap of a twig under his boot was all it took. Her head whipped around, and her eyes, a startling shade of green, locked onto his. The fear in them intensified, mixed with a raw, defiant shame. She sank lower in the water, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. Her arms crossed over her chest, a futile gesture of modesty against the vast, indifferent landscape. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, softer than he intended. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't speak. She just stared, her jaw trembling. He could see the exhaustion etched onto her face, the faint, bluish shadows under her eyes. She was young, barely out of her girlhood, but her expression held the ancient weariness of someone who had been running for a very long time. He took another step toward the water's edge. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes as she glanced around, looking for an escape she didn't have. He knew he had to close the distance, not just physically, but the chasm of fear that separated them. He wasn't thinking about propriety, or what the gossips in town would say. He was thinking of the cold that had settled deep in his bones since Sarah died, a cold that the desert sun could never seem to touch. He sat on the bank and began to pull off his boots, his movements calm and deliberate. He dropped his gun belt next to them, the heavy thud echoing in the silence. Then he stood, unbuttoning his shirt. Her eyes widened further, a flicker of new alarm in them. What are you doing?" Her voice was a hoarse whisper, rough with disuse and fear. "Looks like you could use some company," he said, his tone even. He waded into the river, the tepid water swirling around his denim-clad legs. It wasn't cold, but it was a shock against his heated skin. He moved slowly, not wanting to spook her further, until he was only a few feet away. He could see the goosebumps on her arms, the rapid pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He stopped, giving her space, letting her see that he was not a threat. The sun beat down on his bare shoulders. For a moment, they were just two solitary figures in a vast, empty world, suspended in the slow-moving current of a dying river. He saw the fight in her eyes warring with the exhaustion that was threatening to pull her under. She was astray, cornered and afraid, but not broken. Not yet. He felt an urge to offer something, anything, that wasn't a threat or a judgment. He wanted to offer a moment of simple, human connection. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. A wry, sad little thing. He looked from her shivering form to the murky water around them, then met her gaze directly. "Water's warm," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur that carried easily across the small space between them. He held her gaze, letting the words hang in the hot, still air, an anchor in the torrent of her fear. "So am I." The words, spoken so softly, were a stark contrast to the harshness of the sun and the raw fear that had gripped her. Lou stared at Ethan, her green eyes wide and searching. He wasn't mocking her. Not truly. There was a weariness in his expression that mirrored her own, a deep-seated loneliness that she recognized as if it were a reflection. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, someone was looking at her and not seeing a curse. They were just seeing a person. The tension in her shoulders eased, just a fraction, slowly, as if testing the fragility of the moment. She nodded. Ethan held her gaze for another second before turning and wading back to the bank. He picked up his discarded shirt, a plain cotton garment worn soft with use, and brought it to her. He didn't try to hand it to her directly, but laid it on the rock beside her clothes. "Get yourself dressed," he said, his voice practical now, all traces of intimacy gone. "I'll wait by the horse." He turned his back, affording her a privacy she hadn't expected, and walked away. Lou watched him go, a broad-shouldered silhouette against the blinding sun. She felt a strange, unsettling warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful. It was hope. With trembling fingers, she pulled herself from the water, the air instantly chilling on her wet skin. She dried herself as best she could with her own ragged dress before pulling on Ethan's shirt. It hung on her like a tent, the sleeves dangling past her hands. But it was clean and smelled faintly of dust, sweat, and something uniquely him. It was the most substantial thing she had worn in weeks. The ride back to his ranch was conducted in a thick, vibrating silence. Lou sat behind him on Cinder, her hands resting hesitantly on his hips, careful not to hold on too tightly. She could feel the solid strength of him, the heat radiating from his back. She watched the landscape unfold, the endless stretches of parched earth, the skeletal remains of yucca plants, the distant, hazy mesas. It was a brutal, unforgiving country, but from this vantage point, perched behind a man who had shown her an ounce of kindness, it felt different. It felt like it could be survived. The ranch house was bigger than she'd imagined, a long, low adobe structure with a wide, shaded porch. It looked solid, rooted to the earth, a fortress against the elements. A few scrawny chickens scattered as they approached, and a grizzled old man with a face like a dried apple emerged from the barn, his eyes narrowing with suspicion as he saw her. "Ethan," the man grunted, his gaze fixed on Lou. "This is Lou. Jed," Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She'll be staying with us for a while." He swung down from the saddle and then turned to help her, his hands strong and steady on her waist as he lifted her to the ground. The contact sent a jolt through her, and she stumbled slightly. Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, his disapproval a palpable thing. "Heard tell of her?" he muttered, just loud enough for them both to hear. "They say she brings the drought with her." "They say a lot of things." "Jed," Ethan retorted, his voice sharp as flint. "Most of 'em ain't true. See to Cinder." Without another word, he guided Lou toward the house. The interior was dark and cool, a welcome relief from the oppressive sun. The main room was large and sparsely furnished with sturdy, handmade wooden furniture. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and black. On the mantelpiece, a silver-framed photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes seemed to watch them. Sarah. The ghost was here, in every corner of the house. Lou felt like a profane intruder, a weed in a carefully tended garden. For 3 days, they existed in a state of quiet, awkward truce. Lou, driven by an instinct for survival and a desperate need to be useful, set about making herself indispensable. She cleaned the house until the wooden floors gleamed. She mended Ethan's clothes with a neat, careful stitches, and she cooked. Her meals were simple but savory, made from the dwindling supplies in his pantry beans, cornmeal, and the occasional bit of salted pork. Ethan and Jed ate in silence, their surprise at her skill warring with their ingrained suspicion. Ethan watched her. He watched her move about his house, bringing a quiet order to the chaos of his grief. He found himself listening for the soft sound of her footsteps, the low hum of her voice as she sometimes sang to herself while she worked. It was a dangerous feeling. He felt the betrayal to Sarah's memory like a knife in his gut. This house was their sanctuary, and he had brought a stranger into it. Yet, when he looked at Lou, he didn't see a curse. He saw a survivor. He saw a flicker of life in her green eyes that he thought had been extinguished in himself forever. The inevitable confrontation came on the fourth day. Ethan rode into Redemption Flats for supplies and was met with a wall of hostility. Men turned their backs on him at the saloon. Women pulled their children close and whispered behind their hands as he passed. The whispers were all the same. "That's Cole, the one who took in the Texas witch." The final blow came at the general store. Banker Rowe and Deacon Harlow were there, waiting for him like a pair of spiders. "Cole," Rowe began, his voice smooth and oily. "A word." Harlow stepped forward, his face a mask of sanctimonious concern. "Ethan, my son, the good people of this town are worried. This woman you have taken in. It is an unnatural arrangement, and in these trying times, with the Lord's displeasure so evident in this drought." "My arrangements are my own business. Deacon," Ethan cut him off, his voice low and dangerous. "Not when they affect the whole community," Harlow's voice rose. "And not when your financial stability is in question," Rowe added, tapping a ledger he was holding. "The note on your property comes due in 30 days. Given the circumstances, the bank is concerned." The threat was clear. They were using Lou as leverage, fanning the flames of superstition to isolate him and make the foreclosure easier. He bought his supplies, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, and rode home with a storm brewing inside him. He found Lou on the porch, scrubbing the floorboards with a fierce determination. She looked up as he approached, and the hope in her eyes died when she saw the thunderous expression on his face. "They hate me," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan didn't answer. He just strode past her into the house and slammed a sack of flour onto the kitchen table. Lou followed him, her hands twisting in the damp fabric of her apron. "I should go," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm just bringing you trouble. Jed was right. Everyone is right." "And go where?" Ethan spun around to face her. "Back to the river to be hunted like an animal." "It's better than seeing you lose your home because of me." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of frustration and despair. "I've heard them talk. Banker Rowe, the deacon. They want this land, and I'm the excuse they need to take it." He stared at her, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a cold, hard knot of despair. She was right. He was trapped. She took a deep breath, her chin lifting with a resolve that surprised him. "There might be a way," she said, her voice steady now. "I was in Fort Smith for a time. I heard talk of the law, the Homestead Act. They can't force a man and his family from their land. Not as easily. They can't just foreclose on a family home." Ethan stared at her, uncomprehending. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," she said, her green eyes boring into his, "that if you had a wife, if this was a family ranch, Banker Rowe would have a much harder time taking it from you." The silence in the room was absolute. The idea was so outlandish, so desperate, that Ethan could only stare at her. A wife. The word was a sacrilege in this house. "You're crazy," he finally breathed. "I'm a survivor," she corrected him. "Just like you. I need a roof over my head, a place to be safe. You need to keep your land. This isn't about feelings. It's a deal, a bargain. I'll be your wife on paper. I'll cook and clean and do my part. And in return, I have a home. When the trouble with the bank is over, I'll leave. No one will ever have to know." Ethan turned away from her and walked to the fireplace. He braced his hands on the mantel, his head bowed. Sarah's smiling face in the photograph seemed to mock him. He could almost smell her scent, a faint trace of lavender and sunshine. To do this would be the ultimate betrayal, to put another woman in her place, even in pretense. But then he thought of his father, pouring his lifeblood into this soil. He thought of the vultures, Roe and Harlow, circling, ready to pick his legacy clean. He thought of the crushing weight of his solitude. He was a drowning man, and Lou, the cursed girl he'd found in the river, had just thrown him a rope. It was a frayed, desperate rope, but it was the only one he had. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the cold, empty hearth. "There's a ring," he said, his voice thick with a pain he couldn't hide. "It was my wife's." Lou flinched, as if he'd struck her. "Ethan, no! We can just tell the justice of the peace. We don't need—" "If we're going to do this," he said, finally turning to face her, his eyes dark with conflict, "we're going to do it right. It has to look real." He walked into his bedroom, the room he hadn't let her enter, the room that was still a shrine to Sarah. He came back holding a small, intricately carved wooden box. He opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a simple, slender gold band. Sarah's ring. He took it out, his fingers clumsy, as if the metal burned him. He walked back to Lou, who stood frozen in the center of the room, her face pale as bone. He took her left hand. It was small and rough with work, but it trembled in his grasp. "This is a mistake," he whispered, as much to himself as to her. "I know," she whispered back. With a deep, shuddering breath, he slid the ring onto her finger. It was too big. It spun loosely, a golden shackle that didn't fit. They stood there for a long moment, bound together by a desperate lie. The ghost of his dead wife, a silent witness to their profane pact. The deal was done. They were man and wife, and they were more alone than ever. The ring on Lou's finger was a constant, cold reminder of their lie. It was a circle of another woman's love, and it fit her no better than the life she was pretending to live. The first few weeks of their marriage were a study in distances. Ethan moved a cot into the small office off the main room, ceding the master bedroom to her. He claimed the old mattress was bad for his back, a lie so thin it was transparent. The bedroom was Sarah's room, and they both knew it. Lou slept in the large bed alone, haunted by the faint scent of lavender that still clung to the linens, feeling like a ghost in another ghost's home. But Lou was not one to fade into the background. Survival had taught her that stillness was a form of death. So, she poured her restless energy into the ranch, into the very bones of the house. She declared war on the dust and the silence. She rose before Ethan, the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon greeting him instead of the cold, stale air he had grown accustomed to. She found a patch of stubborn mint growing near the well and started serving it with cool water in the evenings. She took the meager supplies in the pantry and stretched them into flavorful stews that made the ranch hands. Jed and a lanky teenager named Billy. Look at her with a grudging respect. Jed remained her harshest critic. He watched her every move with narrowed, suspicious eyes. When she took it upon herself to patch the worn-out curtains with scraps of gingham she found in a sewing box, he grumbled that Mrs. Cole the real Mrs. Cole had liked them just the way they were, when she discovered a small, untended garden behind the house, choked with weeds, and began the back-breaking work of clearing it. He warned her the ground was cursed, just like the rest of the territory. Lou simply ignored him. She worked with a quiet, relentless focus, her hands becoming calloused, her face freckled by the sun. Slowly, imperceptibly, the atmosphere of the Cole ranch began to change. Laughter, a sound that hadn't been heard in 2 years, occasionally echoed from the bunkhouse when Billy told a stupid joke at dinner. The house itself seemed to breathe again, the windows clean, the air filled with the scent of baking bread instead of stale grief. Ethan observed it all from a carefully maintained distance. He would watch her from the porch as she coaxed green shoots from the stubborn earth in her garden, her brow furrowed in concentration. He felt a confusing mix of gratitude and resentment. She was erasing the quiet shrine he had made for Sarah, and in its place, she was building a home. The guilt was a constant companion, a dull ache in his chest. He was betraying his wife's memory. But as he looked around at the life returning to his ranch, a small, treacherous part of him couldn't deny the relief it brought. The crushing weight of his solitude was lifting, ever so slightly. Their fragile new reality was shattered by the necessity of a trip into town. Their supplies were dangerously low, and Ethan could put it off no longer. "I need to go to Redemption Flats," he announced at breakfast, not looking at her. "You should stay here." Lou stopped wiping the table and met his gaze, her chin set with a familiar stubbornness. "A wife would go with her husband to town," she stated simply. "If this is going to work, we have to make it look real. People need to see us together." He knew she was right. Their arrangement was a performance, and it required an audience. "Fine," he bit out. "But stay close to me. Don't talk to anyone unless you have to." The ride into town was tense. As they guided the wagon down the main street, a hush fell over the boardwalks. Doors closed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. They were met with a barrage of hostile stares, a mixture of fear and contempt. Lou sat straight on the wagon seat, her eyes fixed forward, her knuckles white where she gripped the bench. She was wearing a simple calico dress she had mended herself, her hair tied back neatly. She looked respectable, clean, and utterly out of place in the storm of animosity directed at her. The whispers followed them like flies. "The curse-bringer! Cole's witch!" Deacon Harlow stood outside the church, his arms crossed, his face a thunderous mask of judgment. He didn't say a word, but his silent condemnation was more powerful than any shout. The trouble started in front of the general store. As Ethan was tying up the horses, a woman came storming out, her face contorted with rage. It was Martha Higgins, a rancher's wife whose well had run dry the week before. "You!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Lou. "This is your fault. All of it. You brought this blight on our land." "Ma'am, that's enough," Ethan said, stepping between them. But the dam of public opinion had broken. A small crowd started to gather, their faces angry and afraid. They were a people pushed to the brink by the drought, and they needed a target for their misery. Lou was that target. "Go back where you came from," someone shouted. "Witch!" another voice hissed. Then something came flying through the air. It wasn't a rock, but something soft that splattered against the side of Lou's dress, a rotten tomato. The red pulp and seeds stained the pale fabric like a bloody wound. Lou gasped, stumbling back, the shock and humiliation draining the color from her face. Something inside Ethan snapped. The quiet, grieving man disappeared, replaced by a cold, deadly fury. In one swift movement, he stepped in front of Lou, shielding her with his body. His hand didn't go to his gun, but his presence was more menacing than any weapon. His eyes, cold as river stones, swept across the crowd. "The next person who throws something," he said, his voice a low, chilling growl that cut through the noise, "will answer to me. This is my wife. You will show her respect." The word *wife* hung in the air, a clear and undeniable claim. The crowd faltered. They were afraid of the drought and superstition, but they were also afraid of Ethan Cole's wrath. He was a hard man, and they knew it. One by one, they averted their gazes and began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. Martha Higgins shot Lou one last hateful glare before turning and scurrying away. Ethan stood there, a rigid wall of protection, until the street was nearly empty. Only then did he turn to Lou. She was staring at the stain on her dress, her body trembling, but her eyes were dry. She did not cry. She simply absorbed the blow. as she had clearly absorbed so many before. "Let's get what we need and go," he said, his voice rough. They finished their shopping in a strained, heavy silence and rode home without exchanging a single word. But the silence was different now. In that moment in front of the store, he hadn't been acting. The protective rage that had surged through him was terrifyingly real. He had defended her not because it was part of their bargain, but because the thought of anyone harming her had been intolerable. He had called her his wife, and for a terrifying second, he had meant it. In the days that followed, a new tension settled between them, a current of unspoken awareness. The distance Ethan had so carefully maintained felt artificial now. He found his eyes drawn to her more often, noticing the small details, the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, the determined set of her jaw when she pulled a stubborn weed, the exhaustion that sometimes shadowed her face when she thought no one was looking. He realized that for the ranch to be truly safe, Lou had to be safe as well. She couldn't be a prisoner in the house. "You need to learn how to ride," he told her one afternoon. She looked up from the beans she was snapping, her eyes wide with surprise. I don't know how." "I'll teach you," he said, "and you need to learn to shoot." The next morning, he saddled the gentlest mare in his stables, a calm, doe-eyed horse named Daisy. Lou approached the animal with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Easy now," Ethan said, his voice softer than usual. He stood beside her, showing her how to hold the reins, how to speak to the horse in a calm, steady tone. His hands covered hers, guiding them, and the simple contact was like a spark on dry tinder. Lou froze for a second, hyper-aware of the warmth of his fingers, the rough calluses on his palm. She could feel his breath on her cheek as he leaned in to adjust her stirrup. The riding lesson was a delicate dance of instruction and proximity. He walked alongside her, his hand on her back to steady her, his instructions low and patient. By the end of the hour, she was managing a shaky trot around the corral, a small, triumphant smile on her face. The smile did something strange to Ethan's chest. Then came the rifle. It was a Winchester, heavy and smelling of oil and power. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel at an old tin can he'd set on a fence post. "It's heavy," she complained, her arms wavering. "You'll get used to it," he said, moving to stand directly behind her. "Here, let me help you." He placed his hands over hers, adjusting her grip. His chest was pressed against her back, and he could feel the slight tremor running through her. Her hair, smelling of sunshine and soap, brushed against his chin. He had to clear his throat before he could speak. "Tuck it in tight to your shoulder," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "If you don't, the kick will bruise you something awful. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it." She took a shaky breath, closed her eyes for a second, and then squeezed. The rifle exploded with a deafening crack. The recoil, far stronger than she'd anticipated, slammed into her shoulder. With a startled cry, she stumbled backward, the rifle clattering to the ground. She fell directly into him. Ethan's arms came around her instinctively, catching her and holding her fast against him. Her head was tucked under his chin, and her hands were flat against his chest. For a long, breathless moment, they stood frozen. The world narrowed to the thunder of his heart against her ear, the solid feel of his arms around her, the lingering scent of gunpowder in the air, the pretense, the bargain, the ghosts of the past, all of it fell away. There was only this, a man holding a woman, a moment of unplanned, unscripted, terrifying intimacy. He could feel her breath catch. He looked down, but all he could see was the top of her head, the way her hair caught the morning light. He should let her go. He knew he should, but his arms wouldn't obey. Slowly, Lou lifted her head, her face just inches from his. Her green eyes were wide, not with fear this time, but with a dawning, confused wonder that mirrored his own. The crack in the wall between them had just become a chasm. He finally dropped his arms as if they'd been burned and took a clumsy step back. Lou swayed, catching her balance, her cheeks flushed. They stood in the dusty corral, the rifle lying forgotten at their feet, the silence between them now filled with 1,000 unspoken words. The moment in the dusty corral had changed the air between them. It was charged now, thick with unspoken possibilities. Ethan and Lou began to move around each other with a new, careful sort of gravity, like two planets that had been knocked from their orbits and were now struggling to find a new, stable path. They avoided touching, avoided holding each other's gaze for too long, but the awareness was a constant presence. The walls Ethan had built were still standing, but they were full of cracks, and the light was starting to get in. But in the shadowed back rooms of Redemption Flats, a different kind of plan was taking shape. Banker Rowe. His thin lips pursed in annoyance, looked across his mahogany desk at Deacon Harlow. "This is an unforeseen complication," Rowe said, steepling his fingers. "With a wife, the law protects him. It makes the foreclosure process messy, public." Deacon Harlow's pious expression was curdled with a greed he barely bothered to conceal. "The public is already on our side. They believe the woman is a curse, a sign of the Lord's righteous anger. We simply need to provide them with more proof." Rowe raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Proof." "Evidence of God's displeasure," Harlow clarified, a sly glint in his eye. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I know some men, drifters. They work for coin, not for conscience. A little push, a few unfortunate accidents at the coal ranch, and the town's fear will do the rest. They will drive the woman out themselves, and Cole will be left with nothing. He will be broken, and the land will be ours." The first accident happened a week later. It was Billy, the young ranch hand, who found them. He came galloping back to the ranch house, his face ashen, his horse lathered in a panic sweat. "Ethan, it's the cattle down by the South Creek." Ethan and Jed rode out with him, leaving Lou on the porch with a cold sense of dread coiling in her stomach. They returned 2 hours later, their faces grim. Ethan dismounted, his movements stiff with a barely suppressed rage. "Poison," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Someone poisoned the watering hole. We lost 12 head." Jed, his face a mask of grim certainty, spat on the ground and looked directly at Lou, who had come out to meet them. "The curse is taking hold," he pronounced, his voice like a death knell. "It started." "That's enough, Jed," Ethan snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. But the words were out, and they hung in the air, thick and poisonous as the water in the creek. Lou felt the accusation like a physical blow. She saw it in Billy's fearful, sidelong glance. She saw it in the grim set of Jed's jaw. She looked at Ethan, searching his face for some sign of doubt, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. He was looking at his dead cattle, at the tangible proof of his ruin, and his face was a closed door. She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill running through her despite the heat. The whispers of the past, the accusations from 12 other towns, were screaming in her ears. "It's you. It's always you." The atmosphere on the ranch grew heavy and sour. Jed barely spoke to her. Billy avoided her entirely. Only Ethan treated her the same. But his silence was now a brooding, angry thing, directed not at her, but at the unseen enemy he couldn't fight. He spent his days riding the perimeter of his land, his rifle across his saddle, his eyes scanning the horizon for a threat he couldn't see. The second blow fell less than a week later. They were woken in the dead of night by a frantic whinnying from the horses. Ethan was out of his cot and pulling on his boots in an instant. As he threw open the front door, a terrifying, flickering orange glow lit up the yard. "Fire!" he roared. The small storehouse, where they kept the winter feed and harnesses, was engulfed in flames. The fire roared like a ravenous beast, casting dancing, demonic shadows across the ranch yard. Ethan, Jed, and Billy worked with a desperate, frantic energy, forming a bucket brigade from the well, their efforts pitiful against the raging inferno. Lou joined them, her hands raw, her lungs burning from the smoke, her mind numb with horror. She worked until her muscles screamed and her dress was soaked with water and soot. But it was no use. They could only watch, helpless, as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and the structure crumbled into a heap of glowing embers. By dawn, all that was left was a smoking, blackened ruin and the acrid smell of failure. Their entire store of winter feed was gone. The financial loss was devastating. The blow to their morale was even worse. As they stood in the gray morning light, surveying the destruction, Jed picked up a half-burnt rag from the ground near the ashes. It reeked of kerosene. "This was no accident, Ethan," he said, his voice raspy with smoke and exhaustion. "This was set." Ethan took the rag, his knuckles white as he clenched it. He knew. He had known since he'd seen the first dead cow. This wasn't a curse. This was a war. But the rest of the valley didn't see it that way. News of the fire spread through Redemption Flats like the blaze itself. It was all the proof the fearful townspeople needed. Deacon Harlow delivered a thunderous sermon that Sunday, speaking of a den of iniquity that had invited the wrath of the Almighty. He didn't mention Ethan or Lou by name, but everyone knew who he meant. The Cole Ranch was now a pariah, an island of misfortune in a sea of judgment. For Lou, the weight of it all became unbearable. She watched Ethan grow harder, quieter, the lines of worry deepening around his eyes. He ate little, slept less. She saw him at night, staring into the darkness from the porch, the weight of the world on his shoulders. And she knew, with a certainty that settled in her soul like a stone, that she was that weight. She was the anchor dragging him down. The rumors had followed her for so long that she had started to believe them herself. Everywhere she went, disaster struck. She was a blight, a walking pestilence. She had come here seeking a home, a sanctuary instead. She had brought ruin to the one man who had shown her kindness. The thought was a shard of glass in her heart. To stay would be to watch him lose everything, to love him, and she was terrified to admit, even to herself, that what she felt for him was growing closer to love every day, was to destroy him. Her decision was made in the lonely, pre-dawn hours of a new day. There was only one thing she could do. She had to disappear. She moved quietly in the dim light of her room, gathering her few meager possessions, the mended calico dress, a spare shift, a small comb. She wrapped them in a piece of cloth. She looked at the gold ring on her finger, the loose, ill-fitting symbol of their lie. With a trembling hand, she slid it off and placed it gently on the pillow of the bed she had never shared with him. Her heart felt as though it were being torn from her chest. This was the right thing to do. It was the only way to save him. Clutching her small bundle, she crept out of the room. The house was silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the main room, each tick counting down the seconds of her escape. She reached the front door, her hands shaking as she reached for the latch. "And where do you think you're going?" His voice, low and rough with sleep, came from the shadows near the fireplace. Lou froze, her back to him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't breathe. Slowly, she turned. Ethan was standing there, fully dressed except for his boots. He hadn't been sleeping. He had been watching, waiting. His face was unreadable in the gloom, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. I'm leaving," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't stay here. Ethan, I can't be the reason you lose everything. They're right. Everyone is right. I'm a curse." He took a step forward, his shadow looming large on the wall behind him. "You think running away is the answer? You think disappearing into the night is going to stop Roe and Harlow?" "It will stop them from using me against you," she cried, the tears she had held back for so long finally breaking free, streaming down her face. Don't you see? As long as I am here, they'll keep coming after you. The cattle, the fire, that's just the beginning. I can't watch you lose your home. This land is your life." "No, you don't see," he said, his voice rising, the carefully controlled anger finally breaking its leash. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his frustration a palpable force. "You think this is about the land, about the cattle?" He stopped just short of her, his chest heaving, his face a mask of raw, conflicting emotions. "I don't care about the cattle," he shouted, his voice echoing in the silent house. "I don't care about the goddamn storehouse, and I don't give a damn what those ignorant, superstitious fools in town say about a curse." He reached out and grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm but not painful. He forced her to look at him, to see past the anger to the raw desperation beneath. His eyes were blazing, filled with a wild, terrifying fear she didn't understand. "Don't you get it?" he pleaded, his voice cracking, the shout softening into a ragged, broken rasp. "All of this, the fire, the debt, the whispers, none of it matters as much as this." He stared into her eyes, and in that moment, all the walls he had built, all the grief and guilt and loneliness, came crashing down, leaving him completely exposed. "The only thing I'm afraid of right now," he confessed, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name, "is losing you." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, stunned into silence, the tears freezing on her cheeks. His desperate, unintentional admission of a feeling deeper than any bargain hung in the air between them, more powerful and terrifying than any fire, any curse, any lie they had ever told. Ethan's words hung in the charged air of the darkened house, a confession so raw and unexpected it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Lou stared at him, her mind reeling, unable to process the sheer, terrifying vulnerability in his eyes. He wasn't the stoic, grieving rancher anymore. He was a man laid bare, and the sight of it terrified her more than any threat from the town. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, coiled in her gut. Hope was a dangerous country she had learned long ago not to visit. "You don't mean that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. It was a desperate plea for him to take it back, to rebuild the walls so she could feel safe in their shadow again. "You're tired, and you're scared of being alone. That's all this is." A flash of raw hurt, followed by a surge of anger, crossed Ethan's face. He had just torn open his chest and showed her his heart, and she had dismissed it as a phantom of his loneliness. "Alone," he shot back, his voice rising again, laced with a bitter frustration. "I've been alone for 2 years. Lou, I know what alone feels like. This isn't it. This is something else. Something I haven't felt since before." He couldn't say Sarah's name. Not now. "You're confusing me with a memory," she insisted, taking a step back, needing to create distance. Her own feelings for him were a wild, chaotic storm inside her. And his confession was the lightning strike that threatened to set it all ablaze. It was too much. "You're putting her face on mine." "Damn it! Lou, look at me!" He took a step toward her, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He was fighting his own bewilderment, the shock of his own admission. "I see asterisk, you asterisk. I see you scrubbing the floors and pulling weeds from that cursed garden and facing down a whole town full of hate without shedding a tear. I see the strongest person I've ever known, and you think I can't tell the difference between that and a ghost?" His words, meant to be a testament, felt like accusations. He was seeing a strength in her she didn't feel. Inside, she was a terrified girl, running from a shadow she couldn't outpace. "Stop it!" she cried, pressing her hands to her ears. "You don't know me. You've made me a project, a stray you took in, and now you think you have to love me, to fix me, but I can't be fixed. Don't you understand I'm broken? I bring ruin. I'm the fire and the poison and the drought." Her voice had risen to a hysterical pitch. The carefully constructed dam of her composure finally shattered, releasing a torrent of self-loathing and fear. Before he could say another word, she turned and fled. She wrenched the door open and ran out into the pre-dawn gloom, her bare feet pounding against the hard-packed dirt of the yard. "Lou!" Ethan's roar followed her, but she didn't stop. She ran blindly, her lungs screaming, tears streaming down her face and mixing with the soot still smudged on her cheeks. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from him, away from his impossible feelings, away from the hope that was more painful than any hardship. Her feet, guided by some primal instinct, carried her past the smoking ruins of the storehouse, past the silent bunkhouse, and onto the familiar path that led down to the river. The river, the place where it had all begun. It was her genesis and her only sanctuary. She stumbled to the water's edge, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. The world was a blur of gray and silver in the faint light that precedes the dawn. She looked down at herself, at the patched, stained dress. It felt like a costume, the uniform of the curse. She had to get it off. She had to get everything off. With frantic, clumsy fingers, she tore at the buttons of the dress, ripping the fabric in her haste. She pulled it off, throwing the garment to the ground as if it were on fire. Her thin chemise followed. She needed to be stripped bare, to shed the identity that had been forced upon her. She was not a wife. She was not a curse. She was nothing, and nothing couldn't hurt anyone. She waded into the river, the cool water a shocking balm against her feverish skin. It swirled around her ankles, her knees, her waist. She kept going until she was submerged to her shoulders, the gentle current pulling at her. She scrubbed at her skin with her hands, trying to wash away the soot from the fire, the stain from the tomato, the filth of the town's hatred, the heavy weight of Ethan's confession. She was trying to scour herself clean, to wash away every trace of Mary Louise Carter and the trail of destruction she left in her wake. She sank down, hiding behind the same cluster of boulders where he had found her before, and wept, her sobs lost in the soft gurgle of the water. Ethan had followed her, his initial anger replaced by a cold, sickening dread. He saw her path of flight and knew, with a terrible certainty, where she had gone. When he reached the riverbank and saw her clothes lying in a heap on the dirt, his heart stopped. For one horrifying second, he imagined the worst, that the current, weak as it was, had taken her, that her despair had pulled her under. "Lou!" he shouted, his voice raw with panic. A small, choked sound came from behind the rocks. Relief, so potent it made him weak, washed over him. She was there. She was alive. He didn't hesitate. Just as before, he kicked off his boots and waded into the water, his clothes becoming instantly heavy. He rounded the largest boulder and saw her. She was huddled against the stone, her arms wrapped around herself, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her face was pale and tear-streaked in the dim light, her eyes wide with a wild, cornered look. "Go away," she whispered, her voice a broken thing. "Please, Ethan, just leave me be." "I can't do that," he said softly, moving toward her through the water. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," she sobbed. "I'm poison." He reached her, the water swirling around his waist. He gently took her by the arm. She flinched but didn't pull away. He drew her out from behind the rock and into the open, turning her to face him. He put his hands on her shoulders, his grip warm and steady in the cool water. "Look at me, Lou," he commanded gently. He waited until her terrified green eyes met his. "There is no curse. There is just you. And me." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her shivering body, holding her tight against his chest. He held her as she cried, her forehead pressed against his collarbone, her tears soaking his shirt. He just held her, letting his strength, his warmth, his simple presence be an anchor in her storm. He rested his chin on the top of her wet hair, and looked out at the horizon, where the first hint of pink was bleeding into the gray sky. After a long time, her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He loosened his hold slightly, tilting her chin up so he could see her face. "Listen to me," he murmured, his voice a low, intimate rumble. He looked deep into her eyes, willing her to believe him. He saw the first time he found her, shivering and alone. And he saw her now, and he knew, with a certainty that settled every doubt in his soul, that he had been lost until this moment. He brushed a stray strand of wet hair from her cheek. "Water's warm," he whispered, the words a direct echo of their first meeting, but infused now with a universe of new meaning. "So am I." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but this one was different. It wasn't born of fear or despair. "Don't you see?" he continued, his voice thick with emotion. He brought a hand up to cup her face, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "You're not cursed." He paused, his gaze intense, pouring every ounce of his conviction, his fear, and his newfound love into 3 simple words. "You're mine." The words settled over her, not as a claim of ownership, but as a declaration of belonging, a place to rest, a harbor. She wasn't an outcast. She wasn't a burden. She was his. The last of her resistance crumbled. The fear gave way to a wave of overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful relief. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. In that moment, the bargain, the pretense, the entire world outside of this river ceased to exist. Ethan lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss born of desperation and relief, of confessions shouted in the dark and truths whispered in the water. It was the taste of salt from her tears and the fresh, clean scent of the river. It was clumsy and urgent at first, a raw confirmation of everything that had passed between them. Then it softened, deepened, transforming into something new. It was a promise, a beginning, a silent acknowledgement that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The deal they had made was broken, replaced by a bond forged in fire and flood, in fear and faith, in the heart of a dying river, at the edge of a new day. Their love was finally, truly, born. The walk back from the river was a silent pilgrimage. The world was washed in the soft, nascent light of dawn. And for the first time, it didn't seem harsh or unforgiving. It felt new. They were both soaked, their clothes clinging to them, but the chill of the water was nothing compared to the warmth that had kindled between them. Ethan carried her ragged dress and chemise, a silent acknowledgement of her vulnerability and his role as her protector. When they reached the ranch house, Jed was on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, his face a roadmap of disbelief as he took in their sodden state. He opened his mouth to say something, saw the look on Ethan's face, a look of quiet, unshakable resolve he hadn't seen in years, and wisely shut it again. Inside, the house felt different. The ghosts had receded. Lou, wrapped in a thick blanket by the newly lit fire in the hearth, finally looked at Ethan, a question in her eyes. He crossed the room and retrieved the gold ring from the pillow where she had left it. He knelt before her, took her hand, and slid the ring back onto her finger. This time, it didn't feel like a shackle or a lie. It felt like a promise. Their new reality was a fragile, precious thing, barely a few hours old when the sound began. It started as a low rumble on the horizon, a vibration felt more than heard. Ethan, standing on the porch, stiffened. He recognized the sound, not thunder, but the drumming of dozens of hooves on hard-packed earth. A dust cloud, angry and brown, was rising in the distance, growing larger with terrifying speed. "Lou, get inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Jed, Billy, get the rifles." Lou came to the doorway, her face pale. "What is it?" "It's the town," he said grimly. "They're coming." It wasn't just a group. It was a mob, at least 30 men on horseback, and more in wagons, their faces a mixture of fear, righteous fury, and grim determination. They were armed with rifles, pitchforks, and a simmering hatred that was more dangerous than any weapon. At their head, riding a tall black horse, was Deacon Harlow. His face was a mask of grim piety, his eyes burning with fanaticism. In his hand, coiled like a serpent, was a thick rope with a professionally tied hangman's knot at the end. The mob fanned out in the ranch yard, forming a grim, silent semicircle facing the porch. They had the grim air of an army laying siege. "Ethan Cole," Harlow's voice boomed, cutting through the tense silence. It was the voice he used in the pulpit, designed to stir souls and command obedience. "We are here in the name of the Lord and the good people of redemption, Flats. We have tolerated this blight on our community for too long." Ethan stood at the top of the porch steps, flanked by Jed and a terrified-looking Billy, both holding Winchesters. "This is private property, Deacon," Ethan said, his voice deceptively calm. "You and your friends have no business here." "Our business is the survival of this town," Harlow retorted, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, stoking their fear. "We have suffered under this drought, a sign of God's great displeasure. We have seen your cattle poisoned. We have seen your stores burn. These are not accidents. They are the work of a curse, brought here by the witch you harbor in your home." He pointed a long, accusatory finger directly at the doorway where Lou stood, half hidden in the shadows. "Send out the woman. Ethan, send her out so that we may cleanse this land of her evil. Send her out, or we will burn this house to the ground with you in it." A low, ugly murmur of agreement rippled through the mob. Martha Higgins, the woman who had thrown the tomato, was in the front, her face blotchy with tears and hate. "She killed my stock," she shrieked. "My well is dry because of her." Ethan's hand twitched, moving instinctively toward the Colt at his hip, but before he could speak, Lou stepped out of the shadows and into the full, harsh light of the morning sun. She moved past Ethan, walking to the edge of the porch until she was looking down at the sea of angry faces. She was no longer the shivering, terrified creature from the river. Her back was straight, her head held high, and though her heart was hammering against her ribs, her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. "My name is Mary Louise Carter," she began, her voice carrying across the yard. "You call me a witch. You call me a curse. You blame me for your hardships, because it is easier to blame a stranger than to face a foe you cannot see, like a sky that refuses to rain." Harlow sneered. "The words of a serpent do not listen to her silver tongue." Lou ignored him, her eyes moving from one face to another, searching for a flicker of reason, of humanity. "You say I bring ruin. I will tell you what I bring. 2 years ago, in a town called Havens Point in the Texas Panhandle, a lantern tipped over in the livery stable. The whole town was tinder dry. Much like this one, the fire spread to the boarding house next door. There were 2 children trapped on the second floor." She paused, letting her words sink in. The mob was silent now, listening despite themselves. "The men were too frightened, the smoke too thick, but I went in," she said, her voice quiet but resonant with truth. "I climbed up the back porch, broke a window, and I carried those 2 children, a boy and a girl, out of that fire. Their mother, a woman named Sarah Blake, might call me a curse, or she might call me a savior. The year before that, near the Cimarron River, a family the Millers was struck down with river fever. The whole settlement was afraid to go near them. I stayed. I boiled water. I changed linens. I sat with their youngest daughter for 3 nights until her fever broke. I don't know what happened to them after I left, but I know that when I left, they were alive." A flicker of uncertainty appeared in the crowd. A few men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping from her steady gaze. Her story didn't have the fire and brimstone of Harlow's sermon, but it had the undeniable ring of truth. Harlow saw the tide turning and moved quickly to stop it. "Lies," he roared, raising the noose in his hand. "She weaves a web of lies to confuse you. Has she saved us? No, since her arrival. We have only known suffering. The word of God is clear. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. We are here to do the Lord's work." He spurred his horse forward, his eyes blazing, trying to incite the mob back into a frenzy. "Who is with me? Who will help me cast out this demon?" But just as the crowd's anger began to rekindle, Ethan stepped forward. He moved to stand directly in front of Lou, a human shield. The sound of his Colt Peacemaker being drawn from its holster was a loud, definitive click in the tense silence. He didn't raise it, but held it loosely at his side, his thumb resting on the hammer. His eyes, cold and deadly, were fixed on Harlow. "That's far enough, Deacon," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You've said your piece. Now you and your flock will turn around and ride off my land. You would defy the will of the people. You would defend this creature over your own neighbors," Harlow blustered, though his horse had come to an abrupt halt. "She is not a creature," Ethan said, his voice ringing with a conviction that silenced every other sound. "She is my wife, and the will of the people ends where my property line begins." He slowly raised the barrel of the Colt until it was pointing directly at Harlow's chest. "You want her," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the yard. "You come through me." The standoff was absolute. The mob was a held breath, caught between Harlow's fiery rhetoric and Ethan's cold steel. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind kicking up dust devils in the yard. Then, a voice came from the back of the crowd. "Hold on now, Deacon." It was a blacksmith named Peterson, a large, quiet man who rarely spoke. He pushed his horse forward, his face troubled. "Something about this ain't right." "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Peterson?" Harlow snapped, turning in his saddle. "Have you been bewitched as well?" "No, sir," Peterson said, his voice gaining strength. "But I was in the saloon the day before Cole's storehouse burned. I saw you, Deacon. You were in the back corner, talking to two men, strangers. They weren't from around here. Looked like hard cases." Harlow's face paled slightly. "I speak with many travelers. It is my duty as a man of God." "Is it your duty to pass them a pouch of coins?" Peterson interrupted. "Because I saw that, too. You gave them money. And the next night, the fire started." A wave of murmurs swept through the mob. Suddenly, another man spoke up, a farmer from the South Valley. "Those men, I saw them down by the South Creek. The day before Cole's cattle turned up dead. I thought they were just watering their horses, but they rode off in a hurry when they saw me coming." The pieces clicked into place with an audible gasp from the crowd. The narrative, so carefully constructed by Harlow, shattered in an instant. The fear in their eyes began to morph, shifting, turning into a new, dawning rage. But this time, it wasn't directed at the woman on the porch. You hired them," Martha Higgins whispered, her voice a mixture of horror and disbelief, looking at Harlow. "You did this to us." "This is blasphemous slander," Harlow sputtered, his face now slick with sweat. He looked around at the faces that had adored him just moments before. He saw no adulation now, only suspicion and a cold, growing fury. He saw the truth in their eyes they knew. He yanked on his horse's reins, trying to turn the animal, his piety dissolving into naked panic. "They are lying. She has poisoned their minds." But it was too late. The mob, with its fickle, terrible power, had turned. The noose in his hand no longer looked like an instrument of justice. It looked like a confession. The righteous crusade was revealed for what it was, a greedy, murderous scheme. The men who had ridden here to cast out a demon had found a real one, and he was sitting on a black horse in their midst. The accusation hung in the dusty air, stark and irrefutable. The mob, a single-minded beast just moments before, fractured into 100 confused and angry pieces. The object of their collective hatred pivoted with sickening speed from the woman on the porch to the man on the black horse. Deacon Harlow, who had been their shepherd, their righteous leader, was suddenly revealed to be a wolf. "Liar," a man shouted from the crowd, his voice thick with betrayal. "You used us." "You poisoned our minds against them," another voice added, the tone shifting from anger to a dawning, terrible shame. Harlow, his face a grotesque mask of panic, tugged violently at his horse's reins. The animal reared, its eyes wide with fear, mirroring its rider's. "Fools! She's bewitched you all. Can't you see her devilry at work?" But his power was broken. The spell of his piety had been shattered by the simple, damning testimony of two honest men. The crowd surged forward, no longer a lynch mob, but an enraged jury ready to carry out its own sentence. Several men reached for Harlow's reins, their faces contorted with rage. The noose he still held was a bitter, damning irony. "Hold!" Ethan's voice boomed, sharp and clear as a rifle shot. He hadn't lowered his pistol. He now raised it, firing a single shot into the sky. The crack of the Colt echoed across the valley, a sound that cut through the chaos and froze every man in his tracks. "This is not a public court, and you are not the law," Ethan stated, his voice ringing with an authority that no one dared to question. He looked past Harlow to the blacksmith. "Peterson, ride into town. Get Sheriff Miller. Tell him what happened. Tell him to come now. The rest of you will stay right where you are until the law gets here." No one moved. The desire for vengeance warred with the stark reality of the pistol in Ethan's hand and the hard command in his voice. They had come to his home as a mob, and he had met them with a force of will stronger than their collective rage. Slowly, grudgingly, they lowered their pitchforks and settled into a tense, simmering quiet. Peterson gave Ethan a single, decisive nod, wheeled his horse around, and galloped back toward town, kicking up a plume of dust that marked his urgent path. The wait was an eternity. Harlow sat on his horse, a prisoner surrounded by his former congregation, his face ashen. Lou remained on the porch, a silent statue, her gaze fixed on Ethan's back. She watched the way he stood, solid and unmovable, a bulwark between her and the world. He hadn't just saved her life. He had given her a truth to stand on. The sound of more riders announced the arrival of the law. Sheriff Miller was a man well past his prime, with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much trouble to be surprised by anything. He rode into the yard, his lone deputy beside him, and took in the scene with a practiced, weary gaze the armed mob, the disgraced deacon, and Ethan Cole, standing guard over his home with a smoking pistol in his hand. "Ethan," the sheriff said, his voice a dry rasp, "care to tell me why it looks like the whole town of Redemption Flats decided to have a war in your front yard?" Before Ethan could answer, Peterson, who had ridden back with the sheriff, began to speak. He recounted what he had seen in the saloon, his words plain and honest. The other farmer corroborated his story about the strangers near the creek, one by one. Men who had come to lynch Lou now stepped forward to bear witness against the man who had led them. The tide of testimony was overwhelming. Sheriff Miller listened patiently, his expression unchanging. When they had finished, he turned his tired eyes to Harlow. "Well, Deacon, sounds like you have some explaining to do, and I imagine Banker Rowe might be interested in this conversation as well." A man on the edge of the crowd, who had just ridden in from town, spoke up. "Rowe's gone. Sheriff. Lit out of town not 20 minutes ago. His office is cleared out. Took the morning stage heading east." The final piece fell into place. The conspiracy, so brazen and nearly successful, had unraveled completely. "Deacon Harlow," Sheriff Miller said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy, destruction of property, and malicious intent. You'll hand over that rope, You have a long time to contemplate God's will from a jail cell. Harlow, defeated and trembling, dropped the noose into the dust. The deputy disarmed him and tied his hands. As he was led away, a prisoner in the custody of the law he had so flagrantly mocked, a profound and awkward silence fell over the ranch yard. The people of Redemption Flats were left to confront their own actions. They had been manipulated, yes, but they had also been willing participants. They had let fear and superstition turn them into a hateful mob, ready to condemn an innocent woman without trial or evidence. The shame was a palpable thing, heavy and sour in the morning air. Martha Higgins, who had screamed so vehemently about her dead cattle, looked at Lou, her face a mixture of confusion and deep, gut-wrenching remorse. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it, unable to form the words of an apology that felt so inadequate. She simply shook her head, a gesture of profound self-recrimination, and turned her wagon around, heading back to a home that was no better off, but whose troubles she could no longer blame on a convenient scapegoat. One by one, the others followed. They departed not as a unified force, but as a scattered collection of shamed and humbled individuals. Some men glanced toward the porch, offering a hesitant, almost imperceptible nod of respect to Ethan, and to the woman standing beside him. They were no longer seeing a witch. They were seeing a woman who had faced them down with courage and truth. They were seeing a man who had been willing to die for her. Finally, only a few remained Jed and Billy, who stood near the porch steps, their rifles now lowered. Peterson, the blacksmith, who lingered as if wanting to say more, and Ethan and Lou standing alone at the top of the steps. The world had shrunk to the space of the porch. The immediate danger was over, but the ground beneath their feet had irrevocably shifted. Lou looked at Ethan, her heart a wild mix of gratitude, relief, and a love so fierce it left her breathless. He had been her champion. Ethan holstered his pistol. He felt the gazes of the few remaining men on them, and he knew this was a moment of reckoning far more important than the one with the mob. His confession to Lou in the dark of the house had been for her. This one had to be for the world. He turned to face her, ignoring the others, and took both of her hands in his. "When my Sarah died," he began, his voice clear and steady, carrying easily in the quiet yard. "I thought this land was all I had left. I thought my whole life was tied up in these fences. This dust, I fought for it, worried over it, and I was willing to lose my soul to keep it." He squeezed her hands, his eyes locked on hers, pouring every ounce of his new, profound certainty into his gaze. "I was wrong," he said. "The land is just dirt. A house is just wood and stone. They're not a life. They're not a home." He looked past her for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the men who remained, ensuring they were his witnesses. Then his eyes returned to Lou, and his voice softened, becoming intimate and powerful at the same time. "I don't choose the land," he declared, his voice ringing with the clarity of a vow. "I choose her." He let go of one of her hands and gently touched her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Forever." The word, spoken with such simple, absolute finality, broke the last of Lou's defenses. It wasn't the passionate, desperate confession from the pre-dawn darkness. This was a public declaration, a choice made in the clear light of day, witnessed by the very community that had tried to cast her out. It was a foundation stone laid for a future she had never, ever dared to imagine. A sob escaped her lips, a sound not of sorrow, but of a lifetime of pain and loneliness finally being released. The tears that came were not the hot, bitter tears of fear, but a cleansing, healing flood. They streamed down her face as she looked at him, her vision blurring, her heart feeling as if it would burst with a joy so profound it was almost painful. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being driven out. She wasn't being tolerated. She was being chosen. She wasn't a curse to be endured, but a treasure to be protected. She was home. Ethan's words, a simple and profound declaration of his choice, settled over the dusty yard. sealing the moment in a kind of sacred silence. The raw, violent energy of the mob had dissipated, leaving behind a vacuum filled with shame and a fragile, emerging truth. Lou's tears were a quiet river, washing away years of fear and solitude. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her, not as a possession, but as the center of his world. Peterson, the blacksmith, was the first to break the stillness. He shuffled his large feet, his gaze dropping to the ground, unable to look directly at either of them. "Cole, ma'am," he mumbled, his voice thick with a remorse that was genuine. "What we did here today, what we were ready to do, it was wrong. Fear makes fools of us all. But that's no excuse. If there's anything you need to help rebuild, you just say the word." He tipped his hat, a gesture of profound respect, and then turned, leading his horse away. His words seemed to grant permission for the others to acknowledge their own shame, one by one. The few remaining men from the mob offered their own quiet, clumsy apologies. A mumbled, "Sorry, Cole," a nod in Lou's direction, a quick, averted glance. They were the words of men who had stared into the ugly heart of their own fear and had been found wanting. Jed, who had stood by Ethan with a rifle in his hands, finally moved. He walked over to the porch steps and looked up at Lou. The suspicion that had lived in his eyes for weeks was gone, replaced by a deep, grudging respect. "That garden of yours," he grunted, clearing his throat. "Soil's no good. I've got some manure from the stables I can mix in for you. Might help them tomatoes grow." It was the closest the grizzled old ranch hand could come to saying, "Welcome home." In the days that followed, a quiet miracle began to unfold at the Cole Ranch. Peterson was true to his word. He showed up 2 days later with his wagon loaded with fresh-cut lumber and 2 of his strapping sons. "Figured you could use this for the storehouse," he said simply, avoiding Ethan's eyes. They weren't the only ones. The farmer who had seen the strangers by the creek arrived with a wagon full of hay, a silent offering to replace what was lost. A few other men, those who had been on the fringes of the mob, came by in 2s and 3s. They didn't speak of what had happened. They didn't need to. Instead, they spoke of work. They offered their backs and their hands, and under the unforgiving New Mexico sun, they began to rebuild. Lou was a hesitant shadow at first, watching from the porch as these men, who had so recently called for her death, worked to restore a piece of her new home. It was Ethan who gently took her hand and led her out into the yard. "They're trying to fix more than just a building, Lou," he said softly. She understood. She began bringing them cool water from the well, infused with the mint from her garden. She baked extra bread and brought it out at midday. At first, they accepted it with mumbled thanks and downcast eyes. But soon, they began to look at her. They saw her, not the curse, but the woman. They saw the quiet strength in her eyes, the kindness in her hands. They began to call her Mrs. Cole, and the name, once a lie, now fit as comfortably as her own skin. The true test came the following Sunday. A buggy, driven by the new preacher, a young, earnest man sent to replace the disgraced Harlow, pulled into their yard. Beside him sat his wife, a kind-faced woman with a gentle smile. It was she who walked up the porch steps, her hands twisting a little nervously in her lap.
Mrs. Cole?"
she began, her voice soft. "I know things have been difficult, but the church is a house of forgiveness for all of us. We would be honored if you and Mr. Cole would join us for services this morning." The invitation hung in the air, a bridge offered over a chasm of hurt and betrayal. To walk into that church would be to face the entire town, to sit amongst the people who had wished her gone. Lou's first instinct was to refuse, to stay within the safe confines of the ranch. She looked at Ethan, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's your choice." His eyes said, "Asterisk, but you are not alone." She took a deep breath. "Thank you, Mrs. Adams. We'll be there." Walking into the church was one of the hardest things she had ever done. A hush fell over the congregation as they entered. Every eye was on her. She could feel the weight of their collective guilt, their curiosity, their lingering fear. She kept her gaze fixed forward, her hand tucked securely in the crook of Ethan's arm, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor. They sat in a pew near the back. The preacher spoke of forgiveness, of neighborly duty, and of the dangers of false judgment. His sermon was a quiet rebuke of all that had happened. As the final hymn was sung, Lou chanced to look around. Martha Higgins, her face pale, met her eyes from across the aisle and gave a small, trembling smile. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. It was acceptance. Life settled into a new rhythm, one marked by hard work and a quiet, deepening love. The storehouse was rebuilt, stronger than before. Lou's garden, with Jed's help, began to produce a surprising bounty of squash and beans. The hole in Ethan's heart, the one left by Sarah's passing, had not disappeared, but it had been transformed. Lou hadn't replaced his first wife. She had, with her quiet courage and fierce love, built a new life alongside his memories, a life that honored the past while embracing the future. One morning, just as the sky was beginning to lighten from inky black to a soft, bruised purple, Ethan woke her with a gentle touch. "Come with me," he whispered. He led her out onto the porch. A cool breeze, the first hint of autumn, rustled the leaves of the cottonwood tree. They stood together, wrapped in a shared blanket, and watched as the sun began its magnificent ascent, painting the eastern sky in strokes of fiery orange, soft pink, and brilliant gold. The light crept across the valley, illuminating the mesas and turning the red dust to a warm, welcoming ochre. Ethan pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. The silence between them was no longer awkward or strained, but filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. "I used to watch this every morning," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble. "After Sarah, it just made me feel emptier. It was just a reminder of another day I had to get through alone." He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a love so profound it made her heart ache with joy. "Now," he said, "it feels like a promise." He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "This is our land," he said, his gaze sweeping over the vast expanse before them, the land that had almost been lost, the land that had been saved not by legal tricks or brute force, but by a choice to love. "Our home." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "Forever." Later that morning, after the work was done, he took her hand again. "Walk with me," he said. He led her down the familiar path, away from the house, away from the barn and the corrals, down to the sluggish, life-giving artery of the river. It was here, at this very spot, that their lives had collided. It was here she had hidden in fear, and here he had found her. It was here she had tried to wash away her past, and here he had declared their future. The water, a little higher now after a few scattered showers had blessed the valley, flowed gently, catching the morning light and shattering it into 1,000 tiny diamonds. They stood on the bank, hand in hand, looking at the water. It was no longer a place of hiding or of desperate confessions. It was a witness, a symbol of their beginning, and a promise of all that was to come. Ethan turned to her, his face illuminated by the bright, hopeful light of the new day. He didn't need to say a word. His love for her was in his eyes, in his touch, in the very way he stood beside her. She leaned in and rested her head on his shoulder, and together they watched the light dance on the water. Two solitary figures no longer, but a single, unbreakable whole. Their future as bright and endless as the western sky. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also consider hitting the hype button to show your support. We'll see you next time.